Steve Adler's 2020 State of the City Address, this year presented virtually. Follow along and share your thoughts on social media using hashtag ATXSOTC. We will begin right now.
You are on, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, colleagues on the council, city manager, city staff, my neighbors and fellow Austinites. It is true that the current state of our city is anxious, troubled, and hurting, but it's not the complete truth at this moment. We are also so much more than that. In an almost curious way, the real state of our city is anxious and hopeful. Even as we manage a set of inescapable challenges so stark as to stretch the imagination, we look to a future precisely because it is uncertain that provides us a once-in-a-century opportunity to no longer be bound by who we were a year ago. Some greater power seems to have reinvented us all. This much change all around in almost everything gives us an almost infinite sense of freedom to do what it takes to actually become all that we aspire to be. So here we are now, confronting challenges unlike anything we've ever seen before. So where do we begin? In times of such great uncertainty, what should be our guiding light? I think we begin with and look to justice. Now, this could have been a speech only about COVID-19 and every discussion of things that matter, our families, our health, our jobs, businesses, our schools, our best laid plans. The virus is the elephant in the room. In the dark film this year has been, the coronavirus was the supporting actor that stole every scene. Everyone knows the arc of the virus. The hard choices came fast as we canceled South by Southwest and then moved to avert a public health disaster with stay-at-home orders to slow the spread of a virus we were still learning about. We didn't know if the community would join in such an extreme measure or if incredible disruption would stop the virus. Both did. We saved thousands of lives in our city alone. I want to pause to thank, on behalf of a grateful city, Dr. Escott, Director Hayden, Juan Ortiz, Eric Carter, Dr. Myers, and Dr. Johnston, and Judge and now Senator Eckhart for having such a significant role with so many others in helping to keep us safe. We all want the local economy and our lives back as we knew them before. But the governor's decision to reopen before we had sufficient testing and tracing in place and before our numbers were low enough compounded the challenge. We went on to more permissive phases without knowing the impact of the preceding. We tried to open businesses as they had operated pre-virus, as if the virus was gone. Leaders at the national and state levels gave destructive or ambiguous messages about what we needed to do to prevent a surge. And so the surge came roaring back. Truth is, the virus was never gone. It just hides, waiting for us to invite it back into our lives. And that's when we showed Austin. That's when we showed what Austin can do. We rallied again, focused on masking and distancing and avoiding groups. Again, we stopped the trajectory and we saved more lives, this time becoming a statewide model for what's possible. We learned we have the ability to control the virus by our behaviors, and we glimpsed a future where more was possible. Today, it appears as if we might be at a plateau. Now, that's better than a surge, but it's still dangerous. The virus is real, and the infectivity in our community is still too high. You want a sustained opening of businesses and schools? Drive down the infection rate further than we have right now. Infectivity in our community now is about 10 to 15%. We need to get under 5%. And by the way, any crowd at all gathering for a UT football is not going to help us get there. I read that the university is considering gathering 25,000 people for football games, and I hope they're not really going to try to do this. I'm not sure there's anywhere in the world that's having gatherings of that size at this point, even in places with lower virus infection levels. See, our choices have consequences. People die from this virus. Many people who live through it are carrying injuries that may be with them the rest of their lives. Risks we take with masking and distancing or attending large groups puts at risk the sustaining of the opening of schools and businesses for us all. The virus is more than just an attack on our physical health. It's also a devastating blow to our economic health. Unemployment is at unimaginable levels. Businesses have shuttered, some temporarily and some lost forever. Many of our neighbors don't know how they're going to feed their families or whether they'll be evicted from their homes. Tenants struggle with rent, and homeowners and landlords struggle with mortgage payments. Our hospitality and creative workers and industries, so great a part of our economy and our culture, are reeling. And for many, it's too late. The city is putting more than $200 million into programs and direct aid to mitigate economic impact of the crisis and to keep us healthy. I want to especially thank Director Briceño and Director Holdrab for incredible work helping to get aid and relief out to our community. But it's not enough. We need more help. Congress needs to pass CARES 2 Act, and it needs to provide support directly to cities so we can continue to help ourselves. But COVID-19 is also a moral challenge. In many ways, it makes this moment even bigger than all of that. COVID-19 is not just killing people. Its impacts are disproportionately felt by communities of color. Black and Latinx Austinites are getting infected and dying at higher rates than their white neighbors. How many of us sat at home while we were sheltering in place from the storm and watched essential workers, construction workers, healthcare workers, and nursing homes forced to take risks the rest of us could avoid? That we had susceptible and at-risk neighbors was no longer theoretical. It became very real. And yes, we worried about whether there'd be toilet paper on the shelves, but we began to notice, perhaps for the first time, the economic first responders that were working to restock those shelves. COVID-19 highlighted that we lack the transportation infrastructure to get people to the jobs that make the city run. It showed us the generational vulnerability of neighbors of color who have been systemically denied access to healthcare resources. We saw that during a pandemic, the health of immigrants, poor people, and those without homes is interconnected with our own. We saw that homelessness is not just about people without homes. It's also about nearly 40% of those experiencing homelessness being African Americans. Homelessness is a racial issue, a particularly cruel result of displacement and disinvestment and despair. Our stay-at-home mandate revealed the housing insecurity of hundreds of thousands among us. COVID-19 made it clear how many essential workers lack access to the essentials. And as if there was any way to avoid seeing the racial contours of the COVID-19 crisis, another challenge, forever intertwined with the virus, was heartbreakingly clear and infuriatingly common. When we watched George Floyd plead for his life and call out for his mother before dying beneath the knee of a police officer, overwhelming numbers finally began to disabuse themselves of the fantasy that people of color are equally valued, protected, and safe, even by those sworn to protect us. In Austin, Mr. Floyd's death came mere weeks after the shooting of Mike Ramos. a tragedy we have yet to explain, and an incalculable loss to those who loved him and to his mother most of all. We were not bystanders to the tragedy in Minnesota. Like cities around the country, we too have been living this perverse cycle of police violence, community outrage, and precious few answers. The view of the virus and of our city through the lens of justice and race is one we should not and cannot close our eyes to. We can see it everywhere around us and in everything that we do. Like the mirror that doesn't lie, this crisis is laying bare injustices that have been too easy to ignore for too long. We just haven't dealt with it. It's been a challenge too large, too intractable, too difficult. In fact, it's the kind of challenge that society can only pick up and resolve when confronted with a moment of such upheaval that fundamental change is not a choice, but it's the only option available. History tells us that sometimes it takes a monumental strategy to put us on a fundamentally different and even historically right and just path that we would not otherwise have found. Sometimes great sea changes in direction and inertia necessary for us to fundamentally and transformationally change a society's future happen only because of great disruption. Only when our current dreams seem shattered are we forced to dream anew, to see our world and ourselves differently. When we can no longer do what we have always done, we can realize the dawning of a new day and a new focus on new dreams. Let me give you two historic examples of what I'm talking about. The first is the story of Austin's dam, as related by former UT President Fenris. Seems in the late 1800s, Austin was dreaming about its future, what it would grow up to be. The leaders at the time looked enviously at the growing number of mill towns in the Northeast and how their economies were boosted by building dams and harnessing the power of water for energy to drive what they hoped would be new manufacturing. Austin, the manufacturing center of the Southwest. It didn't work that way. It built the largest dam, I understand, in the world at that time. And then a storm came and washed out both the dam and the dream. And the land surrounding the dam would never develop into manufacturing, but instead would take its place as a part of the University of Texas. From the debris of one future came the eventual realization of Austin as a city of ideas. Another example is the New Deal, rising from the Great Depression. Up until most recent times, this was the depth of economic chaos. Over 20 million people lost their jobs. We know all the stories. Out of that crisis, however, we saw the initiation of new ideas and tools that have been enshrined to this very day. Public works products and Social Security projects and Social Security and other New Deal programs that, for the first time at such a scale, dealt with the relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy, and reform of the financial system. From these examples, we should draw courage and hope. Our history as a city and a country is one of responding to crisis with innovation, generational investments, and finding the will to correct our mistakes. And the bigger the crisis we face collectively as a community, the greater the opportunity for big ideas that represent fundamental change. We get to decide. If COVID-19 is ultimately remembered as an historical backdrop on our city's march to address justice and race and inequities as we have never done before, or whether the meanness and destruction of the virus becomes the dominant memory. Let's act boldly now to become the city that we want it to be. Fair, prosperous, resilient, not despite the challenges of the moment, but because of them. Because of the freedom to change direction that only comes from great change forced upon us. Let's talk about homelessness. Austin has the opportunity, the need, the obligation, and responsibility to move decisively to end homelessness in our community. Austinites living on the streets and in the woods have dramatically shorter lifespans and increased vulnerability to violence and sexual assault. For all of the discussion around this topic, no one wants this for our neighbors. Absolutely no one. For too long, though, we were content to not think too hard about it because we didn't see it. We didn't see the suffering. We didn't see the injustice. We didn't see it because we didn't want to. It made us uncomfortable. We adopted policies that were intended to move it along and to hide it. I am proud this community has embraced the discomfort that comes with big challenges, and that we are working together on the real solutions to homelessness, to end it, not just address it. I am thankful this community rejected calls to return to a time when we asked the police to harass the least fortunate so that we could avert our attention from their needs while doing little to resolve their plight. To the people that signed on to the petition because they were desperate for a solution for people experiencing homelessness, I want to say that I share your impatience. Having chosen this more than just this path, though, and having rejected the false promise of cosmetic fixes, our work is incomplete unless we follow through with the commitment to house the homeless. This will require us to do a better job of inclusively managing shared public spaces. COVID-19 made that commitment even more urgent. Our response to this pandemic brought the city and its nonprofit service providers to work together as never before. We've been able to dramatically increase the number of hotel beds to transition people off the streets. We focused on how our crisis response systems function. We've come up with a clearer map than we've ever had before on how to move forward with this challenge. We need to invest in affordable housing and prevention efforts that make homelessness rare, and in diversion and rapid rehousing programs that make homelessness brief. And we need to significantly invest in permanent supportive housing that ensures that homelessness is non-recurring for those who successfully rise above that experience. The scale of resources to end homelessness is great, but the solutions are real and they are achievable. Austin has shown we know how to solve this problem, as we did by reaching net effective zero for veterans. It's something we have shown we can make great progress on, as we have with youth homelessness. It's also something that this community has been eager to invest in, as we did with the historic $250 million affordable housing bond in November of 2018. And we will again vote this November, I hope, for funding to address displacement. Now is the time, our moment of opportunity, to build on that work and to act boldly to make our city more just. We know that 38% of our homeless population is Black, over 4 times greater than the demographics of the county as a whole. When we work to end homelessness, we are also doing the important work of addressing the symptoms of racial injustice. I want to thank Deputy City Manager Rivera Vandermeide and Director Shorter for such important work they are doing, helping to provide for those without homes. Let's talk about mobility and transportation, Project Connect. With much of the city complying with stay-at-home orders and guidelines to protect themselves and help fight the spread of COVID-19, our roads and highways seem eerily empty. Ridership on public transit plummeted. Our relief from traffic was short-lived. More and more of the economy reopened or adjusted operations. Congestion has returned to I-35 and MOPAC as Austin's eternal frustration. Although many fewer people were not riding our buses and commuter rail, Capital Metro was still carrying tens of thousands of riders a day. These essential workers did not have the option to work from home or the option to drive to get to the jobs that all of us needed done. In our community, far too many of the people most in need of affordable, reliable, rapid transportation to meet their daily needs and improve their lives don't have it. As a result, many are forced to spend disproportionate part of their income on dangerous ways to get around, or they're losing time and, in too many cases, risking their lives to make use of inadequate transportation options. Project Connect is a bold transit plan for the just and accessible city we aspire to be. It certainly addresses traffic, but it'll do so much more. With light rail, a downtown transit tunnel to speed up travel, no matter what vehicular mode you choose, new metro rapid lines and vehicles, and a transition to zero emissions fleet, Project Connect will connect our entire city, creating new opportunity for Austinites, reducing our dependence on expensive personal vehicles, and save lives. The expense and burden of owning a car? Estimated to be in excess of $10,000 per year on average. Shouldn't be the price of admission to participate in our economy. Project Connect is not just a transformative mobility program for our region. It represents a generational investment in a more just and equitable access to opportunity for whole swaths of our community who live in transportation deserts. Project Connect, once fully built, will bring more frequent and rapid transportation to jobs and education and healthcare for tens of thousands of Black and brown households, the essential nurses, medical technicians, and grocery clerks, and countless others more of us have recently come to appreciate as ever before. The potential impact is enormous. Consider that over 200,000 people of color live near what will be new Metro Rapid stations. Nearly 55% of those who live near proposed orange and blue rail lines, and nearly 80% of those near the green line stations, are people of color. Tens of thousands of households living below the poverty level do not have access to cars. Over 57,000 people in poverty and nearly 26,000 households without cars are located where we'll have new Metro Rapid stations. The Blue Line will serve over 26,000 people in poverty and nearly 10,000 zero-car households. The Orange Line will serve 29,000 people in poverty and 11,000 zero-car households. We're going to be able to expand and improve service to our community's highest need areas in the Eastern Crescent with new commuter rail and rapid bus lines. New rapid bus service on MLK and Pleasant Valley could cut transit users' commute by 30 minutes or more, giving people time to spend with their families. We must acknowledge that major transportation investments in our past have done more to deepen inequality, to segregate rather than connect, and to displace rather than benefit. We must learn from that painful past and ensure we do not repeat those injustices. We must ensure that the very communities that we intend to serve with improved transit are actually able to keep living in those areas once the improvements are in place. Along with the historic investment in transit would come a historic investment in preserving the affordability of communities near our transit investments. Banking land for affordable housing before gentrification takes hold, building thousands of new, permanently affordable homes, preserving existing affordable homes. New programs developed collaboratively with residents of the neighborhoods impacted to keep people in their homes. No other city has embarked on a project of this magnitude in a way that learns from the mistakes of the past and makes real, meaningful investments to ensure equitable outcomes. In November, I hope and I believe our council will give voters the chance to right many transportation wrongs in an historically grand way. And I want to thank Assistant City Manager Fiandaca and Director Canale and Cap Metro Executive Director Clark and its Board Chair Wade Cooper for helping to to shepherd this initiative so well in positioning our community for this action. Let's talk about policing in the budget. And let's think big. What if we really wanted to make our cities safer? And we're willing to press the horizons. Are we really willing to engage in the reimagining of policing if it could make us safer? And what does it mean to reimagine policing? And while we're at it, what do people really want to do? Do people really want to defund the police? You know, I am anxious for us to put the politics and hyperbole aside and completely think through the choices surrounding the desire to make us more safe, their implications, and the pathways for whatever we want to do. For example, why is it that we expect our police officers to be our first option in responding to mental health disruptions? It seems that too many of these police calls don't go well. Why don't we expand the availability of mental health professionals so that the police role is one of backup in case these professionals need help? If we could farm much of this activity out to these others, we might not need as many police officers. We should find out. So many people ask me if they should call 911 or 311 for their issue. I'm not always sure the answer. But maybe another question is, why do we need two different sets of operators? What if there was only one number or one set of operators trained to immediately forward every call to where it's supposed to go? Or maybe if the 911 operators were not in the police department, fewer of the calls would be sent to the police. Maybe the police department and the taxpayers could save some money, even while the public is getting better in touch with the right person, if we no longer made the police department pay for 911. We should find out. For the last several years, our local law enforcement leadership, working with criminal justice attorneys, has been examining whether to put civilian scientists and doctors in charge of an independent forensic lab. Maybe that would help with the perception of impartiality. Maybe the court should be paying for this work rather than it coming out of the police budget. We should find out. Some have suggested that we should explore whether internal affairs would be better able to do its work if its investigating officers were not part of the same police force they're expected to investigate. And should the police department have to pay for that? We should find out. What about the academy, where prospective police officers receive their initial training? About half of the curriculum is set by the state, but about 500 hours of instruction are directed by us locally. Do you think we should consider redirecting our half of the training to much more intensive training on issues like mental health intervention? Would the training be more responsive to the community generally if the academy administration were civilians and police officers served as adjunct professors? And if so, would it really need to be the police department that paid for this? We should find out. One of the areas where we have too much violent crimes associated with family violence. These must be horrible calls for police responding to situations where a family member has injured another. In this city, we have places where people can go with their children to be safe and protected before the violence occurs. But right now, if they call, many are put on waiting lists because we don't have enough available space. If we want to do more to fight family violence, is it better to invest in people who respond to the violence once it's occurred, or in providing more shelter space to avoid the violence at all? We should find out. It seems like many, if not most, calls answered by the police and the fire department, for that matter, are health-related calls. This is what EMS does. Maybe they're more trained for this type of call. Maybe increasing the number of EMS personnel would mean there'd be less we'd be asking the police department to do. Maybe such a change in who responds to medical calls might save the taxpayers money. We should find out. These are the kinds of things that are involved in reimagining police, reimagining how we deliver public safety. I'm really looking forward to the continued conversation with my colleagues and the city manager and staff on these items next week. But here's what I'm thinking might be the way to go next week for me. I support engaging in the reimagining of the police department and how we achieve public safety in many different ways. I support the process that City Manager Cronk, the Deputy City Manager Rivera Vandermeide, and Director Muscadin have put into play to evaluate, together with the community, ideas such as those I just went through, including whether and how any idea makes sense and how it would be achieved. And thank you for this work. This concept is gaining some acceptance in large part because you are trusted. So I thank the three of you. That's quite something in this day and age. I do not see how we actually make any of the things happen right away. If we want real transformative change, we have to be prepared to do the work necessary. This will take all of us working together, digging deep, resolving conflicts, removing barriers, being our most creative, innovative, and adaptive. For some things, the path seems more clear. Ultimately, there will be no lasting reimagination realized and sustained without putting in the time, resources, and deliberation. These are important decisions. This reimagining process, however, has to happen fast, and some of the ideas have to be moved on now. To demonstrate the seriousness of this inquiry and to provide greatest transparency, I support removing elements, such as those I just talked about, from the police budget now and putting them into a transition budget category. If you put in the things that I've listed, that transition budget would contain well over $100 million in elements that are currently in the police budget. And then to make sure that we actually do the work to evaluate, recommend, and be ready to execute where appropriate, I support only authorizing expenditures out of the police budget and the transition budget for 6 months. That would mean in 6 months, none of these budgets would be funded without council affirmative action, creating in essence a second budget process in 6 months on these matters. There would also be no need to wait 6 months for budget amendments if they are ready, or if a council member wanted to bring one more quickly. I believe that the academy curriculum lacks sufficient confidence in the community that it will move police personnel to the kind of culture and approach most desired, and we don't know how long it will take us to get that right. Therefore, I do not see how at least the November Academy class can go forward as planned. This is difficult for me because I believe that the Academy is the best way we have to place culture change agents among our officers. And these cadet classes provide us with our best opportunity to diversify our force. We need to examine appropriate force levels today as part of any reimagining that gets executed, where functions inside the police department are undertaken elsewhere or handled in ways that are intended to provide increased public safety. And we need to better understand in the next few days the overtime reserves to see if there are monies there that could be moved to mental health intervention that still needs funding or to increasing capacity of EMS. And finally, from at least a purely public safety perspective, we need to commit to funding and operating more transition and permanent supportive housing for those without homes and those that need a safe place to go. I want the demonstrators and the marchers and the advocates to know how much I respect, admire, and appreciate their efforts to impact the debate that we're having at City Hall. It's made a significant difference in the nature and substance of the conversation that we're having, and I hope that this commitment portends well for an incredibly high turnout at the polls in November, something to which we should all commit. And I want our law enforcement officers to know that your mission and your safety is paramount with me and this council. I know that discussions that center around considering new and different ways to achieve safety can be heard by some as an indictment of performance. I can't help what others say. I do know that the conversation among the dais is focused only on our joint mission, you and us, to find the best ways to keep our communities safe. The discussion I hope we have over the coming few months is one in which I hope you participate, because there is so much for all of us to learn. Finally, on this subject, I want to address police department leadership. The discussion that we're having in Austin about trying to find the best ways to provide for public safety is the same as happening all over the country. We need partners and advisors in this search that are open to exploring and building on new ideas. We need the full data to be presented so it can be objectively considered. We need not only an openness to consider change, but a keen desire to move past the status quo and to look at public safety more broadly, and even mainly focusing on ensuring that we are best equipped to deal with unsafe moments after they occur. We need more than just a willingness to accept change if it happens. We need a champion for change at its best. In years past, this State of the City address would have ended about here, after having laid out the big things that we need to do. And these big things are all transformational: ending homelessness, delivering Project Connect citywide rapid transit, and reimagining policing and public safety. They rise to the moment. But let's also start talking about doing much more. The success of Austin and Texas began at the expense of its slaves. The first census in 1825 showed Austin with 450 slaves, 35% of the total population count. By 1860, the number of slaves were increasing faster than the population at large. Colonization laws gave settlers up to 4,605 acres of land and an additional 80 acres of land for each slave they had, but no land for slaves. Blacks were kept from voting in 1902 with a poll tax, segregated on public transportation in 1906, prevented from voting in primaries in 1923, and we all know in 1928 Austin adopted a land plan that forced African Americans to leave their homes and move to the east side of town, and in 1932 we passed ordinances that moved nearly all of those that had not yet been forced to move. A century and more of deliberate segregation, compounded by a lack of investment over generations, and our own local version of the institutional racism, have had disastrous and completely predictable results. Extreme wealth and wage disparities. Poverty rates for Travis County Blacks and Hispanic residents are 2.5 times greater than the poverty rates for whites. In Travis County, 28% of all people under the age of 65 who are low income have no health insurance, with Hispanic residents most likely to be uninsured. While Black residents account for 8% of the total adult population. In Travis County, 23% of all people booked into the Travis County Jail are Black. A recent report by the Urban Institute and the Center for Policing Equity finds that Black motorists are 4 times more likely to be arrested after being stopped by the police department as white motorists. These statistics reflect not a deficit of ability or ambition, effort, but rather a shameful combination of racist policy, compounded by decades of inattention and disinvestment by Austin's privileged, mostly white leadership over the ensuing generations. We've done a lot to address some of the vestiges of institutional racism and system inequities. I appreciate the work of Professor Pierce Burnett for the work she did with the task force on that subject. She's leading an incredibly wonderful university on the east side of town in Houston-Tillotson. We should all be thinking about providing greater support for that gem in our city, because none of us are doing enough. Our pre-pandemic economic success and stratospheric growth hid and thus delayed the magnitude of the reckoning with Austin's legacy of racism and systemic inequity that's really required. We have been taking concrete steps, but moving too slowly, and people are suffering as a result. We have to acknowledge the roadblocks to prosperity for people of color in Austin were set intentionally, and their impacts will be felt for generations unless we act. We must harness the energy of disruption to remake Austin as a city of real opportunity for all. It's going to require a commitment by each of us to address affordability and displacement crisis, to expand healthcare options and transportation infrastructure to every corner of the city, to ensure that our institutions are just and equitable, and we more appropriately divide the pie. I'm adding my voice to those mayors across the country who are calling on Congress to develop and execute a national program of restitution for descendants of slaves in this country, to address the yawning chasm of wealth gap between Black Americans that began with slavery and has widened over generations through Reconstruction, through the shameful scourge of Jim Crow, and remains an insidious force to this day. But we also must do the work here. We would not be alone in this work. Cities around the country, Asheville, Providence, Durham, Tulsa, and others, are owning up to the physical, emotional, and economic violence visited upon people of color by the communities they call home. And tonight, I'm asking council and the community to begin planning a pathway to atonement and restitution. There is already movement in this direction in our community, and we should support those that are trying to find the way forward. It's going to require us to be intentional about addressing our history and righting the wrongs. It is the work of saying, as we do, Black Lives Matter. I believe COVID-19 will eventually be overshadowed by the big ideas it is helping to put in place. But even more important will be why and how we do the big things. Importantly, each promotes justice when analyzed through an equity lens. History will remember 2020 as the moment that pointed us in the direction of justice, because this was the year that forced us to see injustice unlike any time before. Like someone grabbing and holding our face between their hands and not letting us turn away, forcing us to look at the unfairness around us and our part in perpetuating it. Last year, as I gave the state of the city, I stood at a podium in City Hall chambers and said, race issues remain our most significant equity challenge. This was a year ago. Do you think those words resonated then the way that they do today? There is no justification, I said then, for having a 10-year differential in life expectancy depending on whether you live on the east or west side of town. And that was before the coronavirus. The truth is that last year, we had yet to really grasp the enormity of the opportunity gulf that separates our neighbors of color from many of their white counterparts. 2020 has thus far been a troubled year. I believe it will turn out to have been the kind of necessary trouble that Congressman John Lewis exhorted us to make in the name of progress. Never has the resolve been so great to live in a more fair and more just society than it is today. That hope and dream, the sense that things are somehow different and more different than they have ever been, is wrapped in a feeling of hope and optimism that is equally unique. The time is now the drumbeat grows. The time is now to ensure we exit this time as a more just city than we were when we entered. We can do this if we're not scared to think big. This is the moment to define who we are. We should dedicate ourselves to doing justice, and not in little ways. We must rise to the moment and change history. Motivated violence by agents of local government and law enforcement will not recur. Perhaps only at times such as these, when our routines and inertia are so utterly disrupted, can we be free and forced to dream and act big. We can get swallowed by the challenges, or we can see them as freeing us to think in grand ways and differently and truly deliver a new kind of tomorrow. So let's do big things. Let's end homelessness. Let's bring real mobility to Austin. Let's reimagine how we keep one another safe. Let's address race and do something about correcting centuries of injustice, because it is the fundamental injustice that fuels so many others. I want to note also that I think that most everything that I have said here tonight about the principles and values and goals and aspirations and priorities that guide these efforts are shared by all of my colleagues on the City Council. And I want to say what an incredible honor it is to serve with them. And I want to thank my Chief of Staff, Leslie Varghese, and my entire staff. I learned so much from them. And let me conclude by recognizing that doing these three big things will require a major disruption of the status quo. All of these challenges and others require a reckoning with racial disparities that exist in every corner of life in this city. We have to recover, but shame on us if we rebuild systems as inequitable as before. Let us embrace the remarkable gift it is to have so much undecided and up in the air. Let's celebrate the opportunity born of the necessity to rebuild. Let's commit to be guided by a search to deliver justice. Let's join in a disruptive recovery, seizing the moment to rebuild in a just and equitable way. Thank you.
Stay tuned for media availability in a few minutes.